Welcome back, Reg audience. This time it's Flash 2. This time it's pervasive. Something along those lines. Welcome. It's our third Regcast in the week. I hope you've been along for all the live Regcasts. It's we've had a good time in the studio. Tony's been living down here for this week, and this one's going to be very relevant to a lot of you, and the sort of things, the planning you're going to be making, the purchasing decisions you're going to be making in the next 12 months. As you can see, Flash, see the, is that a clip art of a USB stick? We're going to have to invest in some more clip art. We really are. But you get the picture anyway for it. And the reason we're doing this is because 12 months ago, we did a Flash Regcast about where you should deploy Flash. And now, of course, all the prices have changed. The technology's changed. So basically, if you want to go and look at that one on demand, don't believe a word of it. We're updating it now. This version 2.0. And James, who did that last time, he's back in the studio this time to account for his errors. Yeah, his errors. Not until you're introduced. So, who's in the studio? Well, James, I've already half introduced you. Welcome back to the studio. Yes. To remind the audience, what do you do at HP?
So I'm part of the European pre-sales team for HP, focused on primary storage, and also very heavily involved with HP's Flash strategy and helping customers transition to the all-Flash data center.
It's been a busy year for you, though.
It's been a very busy year. It has, and it's going to be a busy couple of years, I think, as well. So it's, which is good. It's good.
It's good. Yeah, I mean, it's good. You know, if things change again, you'll still carve out time to come back and see us.
Of course, definitely. We'll just be talking about a different memory technology, probably.
Yeah. How many times is this in the studio for you now?
I think it's 3 or 4.
Absolutely. So you've got.
I'm not quite living here yet.
You know, but you know how it works.
I do.
So this is fine. Joining you today, new to the studio, but you're very welcome. Phil with a double L from HP.
That's right. Yeah, my first time.
Yes. Now, what do you do, Phil?
So I'm essentially a UK-bound version of James. So I'm again Flash, primary storage, but I'm based exclusively here in the UK.
Does that make him your boss, or are you just
no,
different?
He wishes, but
locations for that. And so you're very welcome. And Tony, welcome back to the studio. It's like we've never been away.
It is indeed, Tim. You know you can't keep me away, even if you tried.
You love talking about storage.
I talk about everything, Tim.
Now the trouble with storage is that there's a lot of legacy stuff kicking around, isn't there? And it's very difficult to move on. But this is a time when we do have to move on, isn't it?
There's certainly, storage is changing dramatically, and people do need to get ready for change.
Yeah. Now you have, I mean, you do have a lot of experience in managing legacy technologies.
Yep.
Don't you? I wonder if we have any evidence of that.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, yes, we do. This is you at home, just to remind you of you at home.
As you can see, surrounded by high tech.
Yeah, exactly. And they're on the back of the other analysts.
And this was the middle of summer.
Yeah. I'm glad I don't.
Well, you know that analysts were cowboys, so.
So yeah, it's just a little. You're wearing a cowboy hat, honestly. What's this? Now we've got a few questions already from some of you guys. We're not going to answer your questions now for Bill and Chris and Randy. For those of you who've already submitted questions, we'll be putting those in later because we've got very relevant areas to put them in. It will make more sense if we answer them in order, but we will do. If you do have questions as we go through, please ask those questions and we will answer them while we're in the studio. Don't leave the questions for the last 5 minutes. They always flood in near the end, just at the time when we can't answer them. So please, get them in nice and early, ask those questions, and our team will do their best with them. Let's crack on, Tony.
Okay.
So, set the scene for us. Pressure on storage.
Yeah, pressure on storage, it's the motherhood and apple pie. Everybody's aware of all these factors, you know, so more data, etc., etc. But the two things that are really important are the changing business expectations that people want and demand to get access to everything as quickly as possible all the time, and the need for greater flexibility and responsiveness in particular, so that they really do demand, you know, the best performance that they can get. All of these things are combining together with, you know, changes in business generally. So.
Is more attention being paid to storage now?
Yes, certainly. Over the last 2 or 3 years, from being the afterthought that was just hanged on to a server, purchase that in turn was part of an application buy usually. Things have changed dramatically now, so that storage is seen on its own for the first time ever in IT.
I noticed you nodding along.
Yeah, well, actually, I was going to say, and if you look at what's happened, you know, compute has gone, you know, through the roof in terms of its performance. Network bandwidth is finally, you know, making big jumps, and storage has become, you know, the issue in the corner. You know, and as a business, we're focused on user experience because the good old mobile phone has turned us all into consumers in our workday. You know, and we're seeing new service levels, and it's not just about uptime and replicating data. It's about delivering information in a quicker period of time. You cannot do that today with some of the legacy storage architectures, and they're the business drivers, and you've got a load of technology drivers underneath that that are really pushing us towards the all-flash data center, I think. You know, there's a combination of those things.
And a lot of that's driven by those new and changing application needs, you know, performance very much in the center.
But we also have structurally in the IT department, the storage guys have been off on their own, doing their own thing. I mean, for good reasons historically, but Phil, that's got to change as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The way that we deal with storage, the way we manage storage is changing dramatically. You know, automation is a big thing that's happening. You know, the more and more businesses I talk to, the way that they deal with their storage is changing. You know, that hands-on approach is disappearing.
Right, so let's have a look at some of the trends, Tony, on your
Indeed. So again, it's a chart we've used before, but it's still extremely applicable. So people are using all the traditional storage technologies, absolutely. But as you can see at the bottom, the more advanced solutions, solid state and flash, are right up there, along with the whole automation of management side of things. That's very much in focus, along with scale out. So we want to get things out there faster, quicker.
So this stuff is actually being bought?
It's being bought already, and as the next chart will show us, how do people think things are going to change? And as you can see, you know, some of the traditional storage technologies, there are people who think they're going to be using less of those. Okay, a lot more think they're going to be using more of it, but the stuff that's really only positive is right at the bottom. As you can see, what's that? 70-80% of people think they're going to be using a lot more solid state storage, flash, in the future. You know, over the course of the next 3 years, it's happening now. Very much going to be there.
So, so I guess the limiting factor then, James, is if you're going to be using more of that, you really got to understand how to use it, because you don't just use it in the same way. Absolutely,
yeah. You know, yes, we're putting flash into a storage array, but we do have to treat it a little bit differently. The architecture around flash has to be different because it doesn't behave like a disk drive. But also, when it comes down to, you know, storage guys, you know, they did have their own little kingdoms. But, you know, there's a good way to kind of look at it. And I think there's some resistance there because flash means that you don't have to worry about it, and that's absolutely not the case. You know, you still have to capacity plan, you still have to manage it, and where lots of people are looking at automation because there are big gains to be had from that, I think the storage teams will start focusing more on the automation to make that part right. The element of flash, I think, just takes, you know, a level of complexity away, certainly from what we have today, where we have tiering and lots of different things to look at and different performance models and that sort of stuff. So, you know, there's a big shift. There's a big shift happening currently.
The important part here is it says enterprise level, so enterprise class. So it's not just the performance; it's also the other functionality that you need to wrap around that to make your storage reliable, available, out there for all time.
Sort of things we're going to get to later on, isn't it, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely. And enterprise is kind of one of the last places that flash is really making, you know, a big stand. It's the last place where flash adoption isn't there at the moment, and it's a matter of bringing that forward and making that happen.
Because it's already.
Yeah, lots of small businesses have already embraced flash somewhere, if not totally, in their environment.
I suppose, yes. Yes.
It's the way budget cycles work as well. So the technology, as we said last year, was great for some niche cases. Now it's much more broad. But again, when you refresh your storage infrastructure, as we'll get to a bit later on as well, it's in certain scenarios. So you've got storage, you're going to be using it for some time, but now the enterprise, it's ready. So the technology's matured, people are ready for it.
The other big thing with the enterprise, just as a kind of a final comment, is if you're a small to medium business, you have processes built around what you do. If you're an enterprise, you have processes built around everything, and they are complicated and they have been there for a long time. And putting something, they are very hard to change. Much harder in an enterprise because it's not 5 people that have to sign it off; it's 500 people that have to agree to a change. So for the enterprise, I think it's not, you know, there is a slower adoption because, you know, it's critical for them that something works. But the process change around managing it and delivering it as a service, that element is a huge piece of work to undertake, and it does not happen overnight.
Guys, I've got a fundamental question that's just come in. We've got to answer it. isn't this all moot if it's all moving to the cloud anyway?
It's a good question. So
yeah.
If you're, and cloud means lots of different things to lots of different people, you know, and there's lots of different use cases in the cloud. So it could be, you know, a Hadoop type use case. It could be, I just want to throw all my VMs out there because I don't want it to be my problem. There's a whole load of security stuff that comes with going into the cloud. But let's think about cloud, you know, and I was with a customer yesterday, you know, their data center today has, I don't know, something like 1,000 blade chassis in it. They can't keep putting servers in and they can't fit any more storage in. So at some point, they have to make a decision that says, do we build a new data center or do we take all of the spinning stuff, which today takes a lot of space, a lot of power and a lot of cooling and a lot of management, and start systematically replacing that with flash, which takes less space, less power, less cooling and is easier to capacity plan. If I can get the right compaction rates, and we're going to cover that later on here because one of the really important things around flash, and keep my cost model the same, therefore my cost to the customer is the same, then that transition can happen and all those benefits of power, space and cooling, they then start to become real because there are a lot of people that are, you know, primary buying concerns are around power, space and cooling. And I was in Ireland yesterday with a customer that is in exactly that situation. Do they need the performance of flash? No, but they need the other benefits that come with it.
And in truth, that the research that the Register audience have given us over years and years says that, you know, very, very few organisations think that everything's going to be going to the cloud. And even if they do, the last thing that's going to go is the storage, is the data, because data's hard to move anyway. So you've got to have lots of trust in those services, make sure that they give you the latency and the performance and everything else that you need, as well as the security. But it's really something that's not going to happen overnight. So will everything ever go all to the cloud? I'm sceptical, probably certainly not in my lifetime.
Meanwhile, we're going to give some advice about how you build that in now. Yeah.
One thing I was going to say quickly around cloud is I have conversations with customers and they say to me, we're looking at cloud and, you know, and they say, well, the cloud will give me SLA on availability. And one of the things we're highlighting there is an SLA isn't a guarantee, it's an SLA. It's, if it doesn't happen, we'll give you service credits, we'll give you whatever. If we can't hit that, but that's not a guarantee that they can do it. Whereas if you've got that kit on site and it's built for you, you know it can provide exactly what you require.
Yeah. And that very much ties into this slide. The challenges that people face with their existing environments, very much the high management overhead side, so the lack of automation, the fact that we've got lots of reasonably complex processes to get in there, and service level shortfalls. Very much now highlighted in storage in particular, rather than just the generic IT infrastructure, as being something that needs to be looked at. And then there's the two sort of things that have been around forever with storage, lengthy time to recover from a failure, still a challenge in lots of ways depending on quite how you're recovering, and underutilization of capacity, to get back to the, you know, spinning disks thing. Once you start using disks beyond a certain element, the performance tends to fall off, and so therefore traditionally people have not tried to put too much data on their spinning disks, because otherwise things tend to get very slow very quickly. And bottom of there, but very, very important, failure rates. We've got to make sure that we trust this storage so that we don't have those lengthy recovery times too often.
Important when we're talking about flash.
Important when we're talking about flash in particular, because it's a newer technology. People want to know, can we trust this now for those enterprise demands?
Well, let's have a look then. Let's whiz on now, James, to talk about what we mean when we're talking about flash, because it's not quite as simple as one thing, is it? So take us through this.
Okay, so I think, you know, a year ago when we were talking about flash, you know, it was expensive. There was new architectures, changing architectures, lots of different ways to deploy it. But because of the cost, you know, we really saw three main use cases that warranted spending that amount of money. And actually, really around user experience, if you think about VDI, and you've got 1,000 users using a virtual desktop and the performance is poor, it's not a happy place to be in IT, you know, because you're fielding all of the calls for some unhappy people. So VDI made it a very good use case because it was worth spending the additional money to make sure that you had 1,000 users that were happy. And likewise, you know, there were, for most organizations, there's one application, and when we put database and analytics, but there's one or two applications which, you know, make the whole business run. And again, you know, flash was exceptionally expensive in comparison to disk. But the benefits that you got, you know, doing more transactions per second or being able to generate a business report in a fraction of the time, they would warrant the additional spend on flash technologies, and that's really where we were for most of last year. They were the 3 biggest use cases that we've seen. And that's changing dramatically, and it's changing because the technology is changing, because architectures and deployment methods are changing, and because we're getting very good at reducing what we're storing or actually increasing our effective capability to store data.
Our Regcast last year was basically about use it for this, don't use it for that, wasn't it?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, it was very much so. And these are the good use cases, these are where you can justify it, but you can't really justify it for everything. 12 months later, a lot has changed.
And here it is, 12 months later.
And this is kind of where we're at now. We're talking to customers, and there's lots of different reasons. And Phil's going to cover, the 2 main ones, that's helping customers transition from what we can see on the left there, which is kind of, I would say, niche use cases, but certainly defined use cases into using Flash for general purpose everything. There will always be some data types that will be just as good on disk as they are on Flash. Sequential workloads is a good example. So we're not saying that disk will disappear, but I think we're at a point now with the technology, both the physical technology and the software that goes with it, where we can help customers look at it for a much broader set of applications, and therefore get the benefits of performance, get the benefits of latency, reduce the power, space and cooling, and free up the storage guy who has spent his whole time firefighting, this bit's going a bit too fast, I've got no space there, I've got space here, freeing up his time to do something more valuable, which at the moment for most of them is automation. And there's big benefits there.
Be specific with me, guys. What's happened with price?
What's happened with price?
Yeah.
So, we're going to cover it on the next slide, but it is tumbled. It's tumbled. The technology
Move on
changed.
to the next slide then. There we go.
So I won't steal Phil's thunder.
Go on, Phil. Tell us what's happened with price.
So, this is one of the key things that's really changed. In that, when we were talking 2 years ago, we were talking about this SLC technology. We were talking about very high performance, very high endurance technologies that came with a significant cost. They're great, and that's why we talked about niche applications, because of the cost element. Newer technologies have come out. We've had EMLC out for a while now, and one of the first things array vendors did was to move to EMLC to reduce the price. And the endurance was generally good enough on EMLC storage that actually SLC, the endurance, the performance weren't really required because people weren't pushing them. We looked at our own arrays on our own install base, and most of our SSDs were 95% idle. So we're not hitting any of those requirements. So that easily allows us to move to a new technology and embrace that and reduce cost. After that, we can then got CMLC. So CMLC storage is the flash actually inside the SSD is almost identical to the EMLC. The big difference is what we do in the background. So we have less hidden space in the SSD, so less over-provisioning space. That reduces the cost of flash because you're getting more usable out of the same drive. But the big problem with CMOC drives is endurance. They just don't last as long. So the technology now comes around not just getting performance out of the SSD, but increasing the endurance of the SSD, making it last longer. And once you can do that, once you can make the SSD last longer, you can embrace that new technology, move to CMOC. It's a much more cost-effective technology, and that allows you to produce an all-flash array at the cost of spinning disks. That's the big change.
And as an example, I go back. I had a customer 5 years ago that deployed 1.4 terabytes of SLC memory into a big tiered array at significant cost, probably about $55 per gigabyte. So he bought what he could afford, and he got a lot of benefit out of it. That customer this year replaced his arrays and bought 19 terabytes of flash at a list price today of probably around $10 or $12 per gigabyte. So it's an order of magnitude we're talking about. It's not a couple of pence or a couple of dollars. It's a significant drop in price. The architecture and the software that we wrap around that to make CMLC last longer and behave like it should do and give us the performance, and that's where all of the clever stuff comes around from there.
This is where architecture is key, because you can't just take CMLC technology and drop it into any existing array. There's a lot of work that has to go behind that to make it last, to make it perform the way that you need it to.
I was talking to someone else who does a similar job to you in another company, and he was and he said that's what a lot of his customers are sort of asking for at the moment.
Yeah.
They're just saying, can you give us something, and they're just going to put it in their server room and just plug it in like they did before. And so you say, on one hand, it's great to be asked for stuff. On the other hand, it's the start of a longer conversation, which is the conversation we're going to have next, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
it. Can I ask you a question, another question about types of flash then, please? One that we had earlier from Chris was saying, what does HP think of ultra-dim flash?
Ultra-dim is a slightly different conversation because that's not generally an array-based technology, that's a server-based technology. So we've actually got some stuff about that coming up later about different deployment methods for flash.
Oh, okay,
so,
we save that one for later?
Yep.
Good. Hang on, Chris, we'll talk about that later on. We'll do that. Good. Well, let's also have a look at compaction. This is something we've mentioned this in passing.
We have, yeah.
Yes. What's compaction now?
Compaction is really, really important when it comes to flash, because when we talk about flash, we talk about, we talked about high cost, we talked about reducing the cost of flash, but even when you've got technologies like CMOC and you've got the architecture right, CMOC is still a relatively expensive technology. Once you can bring in compaction technologies, that's when you really start driving down the cost of flash, because we can use technologies like thin provisioning, like deduplication, and those allow us to take the same amount of capacity, some amount of data, and squash it down into less actual capacity stored. And by doing that, we reduce the requirement to buy flash, so you actually buy less flash to give you the same effective capacity, and that obviously helps reduce the cost as well, because you're buying less actual storage in the back end, less raw storage.
Lots of the raw data that you store these days has a lot of wasted space in it, effectively, simply because of the type of media that we're collecting. So the ability to compress it down into the basics, it's something that's been used in network transmission when bandwidths were quite low.
Yes.
So that's where it originated, the idea of compressing data so that you actually shift as little as you can. Now it's being used to actually store the raw stuff as effectively as possible.
But we were sort of released from this a little bit for a while, weren't we? Low utilisation of hard disks.
It's almost the flip side of disks, where we had this huge pool of disks and a huge amount of capacity to provide a relatively small amount of actual needed capacity, but to hit the performance that we required. Whereas flash almost flips that on their head, because we end up with so much performance to get the amount of capacity we need, that performance just isn't an issue anymore. In fact, capacity becomes the issue rather than performance, and that's a great place for a lot of businesses to be, in that they know that they can pop in this amount of flash and it will give them the performance they need.
Great place to be, but then they have to look in more detail at the sort of data that they've got. How they work with it.
Yeah. I think it's a bit more binary than that as well, because if you think about what you were typically buying, you'd go and buy a 100 terabyte tiered array, and what we hear a lot in the market from a lot of vendors is flash the price of disk. It absolutely is not, right? It only is the effective price of disk if you can manage to reduce your data. And so, for the audience out there, when looking at it, the way to look at it is to think, right, well, if I was to buy 100 terabytes of tiered storage, which today is the most common way to buy storage, if I was to think, right, I'll need half of that in terms of flash, because I think I'm going to compact by 2 to 1, nice safe number. What you'll probably find is the capital cost of the 100 versus the 50 will be roughly the same. It's not cheaper than disk, and you're buying less of it, but you'll probably be able to store the same amount of data, or possibly more if you get a better compaction ratio. So that's the first thing. You've really got to think about that, because there's a lot of marketing noise that it's the same price and it isn't. The second big thing to think about is, how do you take that to a procurement person? Because the procurement person will want to buy 100 terabytes all day long.
Yes.
So our procurement, the thought around procurement is that there's an education piece there that says we bought like this for 15 to 20 years. Now we're going to buy this, and we have to think about buying it differently.
And, to be fair, it does sound like a bit of a trick, doesn't it?
Well, but it's also the same flip side of that, is that you went and bought 100 terabytes before, but you knew when you bought it that probably you were never going to be able to use more than about 40, 50, 60% of it anyway, because otherwise your performance falls off a cliff, and therefore people start noticing. And then when you went to the procurement people and they say, well, have you got any disk space left? Yeah, we have, but we can't use it.
Why did we buy it then?
Exactly. Yes. So procurement people live, and I used to be an IT guy, live in a world of their own. They've got their own metrics that their performance is rated on, and they certainly don't. Most of them don't understand technology, which is why the sales guys have to go out and sell to the procurement people just as much as to the IT guys in the audience today.
If any of you are in procurement watching today, I'd like to apologise for Tony's comments. We're not saying you're not good at your job, we're just saying that
you measure differently. You've got different drivers.
Measure it differently. Let's have a look about why people are purchasing storage, though, Tony, because this is good information.
Again, the register audience have told us, well, wait, why do we buy storage? Actually, for the first time ever, the need for a performance upgrade has got close to the top, if not at the top. In the past, it was always because we had a new application, which is still on there, or that we'd run out of capacity. But now, we need a performance kick. Or we're doing much more broad system architecture changes, virtualization, the sort of things that we were talking a bit about earlier. And so all of the older stuff is still in there, contract renewal time, end of life of the kit, etc. But, top of the stack, performance.
Right.
That's really hit the highlights now.
So we are going to spend basically the rest of this morning working out how you build something that does perform. Don't
you can see that failure is still in there. So if one of our existing kits gone down, but luckily that doesn't happen too often. But right at the bottom, when the supplier offers us a really good deal, make of that what you will. Not a big driver, but obviously nice to get when it happens.
It's always good. It's always good to have. Yeah, I mean, we don't get involved with that. So now, Tony, you came up with this when you have some discussions about how potentially you use Flash. As I said before, then some people are thinking, build a Flash array and just use it.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's a bit more complicated.
It is more complicated, and I think it always will be more complicated. Now, I've talked to a lot of the Flash guys that only sell Flash solutions. They've got nothing else in their company, and for them, the idea is that everybody's going to go all Flash.
They're the top left here in the yellow bit. Yeah,
it's a bit like the cloud guys saying everybody's going to go all cloud. And the reality is that that's probably not going to happen in many use cases.
Let us know though if you're thinking of going all Flash. If you're there, tell us why.
There absolutely will be some where it makes perfect sense.
Yes.
But then you've got the currently existing traditional one, Flash plus combination of HD, so spinning disks. Right at the bottom, then you've still got this thing called tape. Everyone think tape's dead.
You're just hanging on to tape because you don't want the world to change.
It's interesting because, again, tape is relatively low cost for the capacity, and if you don't need fast access to the information stored on it, then it might be a good repository to back up Flash, where you've got your active data and an archive sitting on disk or potentially tape, on LTO tape or cloud. And the LTO 6 and the LTO 7 have got huge capacity. They look just like file systems. They can store information for a very, very, very long time, low running costs because you're not spinning them all the time, so you've got the low electricity. Same as with the SSD. So that's something that might make a lot of difference.
So the bottom left here, the red quarter of the circle, Flash, cloud, and tape.
Well, no, it's Flash, cloud, or tape.
Flash, cloud, or tape, right? Yeah. But no ordinary.
That's again, it might meet some people's needs. Or then there's the life, the universe, and everything option in the bottom
just
right.
A little bit of everything.
Flash, spinning
which
disks,
is probably going to be more
and
where
possibly
everyone's
cloud.
going to end up.
For a long period of time, I think everyone is going to be.
That's where the bulk
whether they like it or not, they'll be on the bottom.
Just because of what you've already got.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at it, we've got we get a lot of information from our arrays that dial home, and I've seen numbers from all the vendors. If you think about your overall written data, the stuff that you have stored, 80% of that is probably never being accessed. So the argument is, well, if it's not being accessed, why would I put it on Flash? If Flash costs me the same price as disk, who cares?
Yeah.
It's valid, and it puts off the archiving conversation, which has always been in the very difficult pile.
Yes.
But I think what will happen over time, these will change, is it will force people to understand their data.
Absolutely.
Because they won't want to put it in all Flash because they know it doesn't need to be there. And that will force them to look at other media types to put that data into.
And that's really the fundamental thing. If you know what your data is, something we've talked about time after time, then you can really start making logical decisions on this rather than just inertia-based decisions on that's the way we've always done things.
Talking about yes.
Well, I was going to say there's an argument as well. So we talk about disk as you don't need Flash, but if Flash is there at the price, the initial purchase cost, let's say, of disk, then actually Flash is almost the perfect place to put your data that doesn't really move because it has virtually no TCO. It uses less power, it produces less heat. So actually, it's a great place to put archive data as long as we can get the price in the right place. And that really is the key to making that happen.
Is the price going to continue to fall?
Absolutely. As new Flash technologies come out and we can take advantage of those, Flash prices will continue to go down.
Yeah.
So we're going to end up with like archive Flash.
Well, I mean, if you look at, if we go back to a previous slide, we had TLC on there, which is not really talked about by many vendors at the moment. And the reason being is today the endurance on TLC is on the floor, right? You couldn't even put it in a laptop. It's that bad. But then if we go back, EMLC was like that not so long ago. So it won't take the NAND flash manufacturers long to get that technology to where it is. And with TLC, we would expect another big price drop. And then there are a whole ton of other memory technologies out there, all different weird names. There's, you've heard of 3D NAND, and HP's working on Memristor. There's lots of different stuff, and they will all change the dynamics, both around price, around performance, around only being powered up if it's being accessed. So we are going to see a massive amount of change. And I think at the moment, it could go either way. NAND is the most commonly deployed because everyone understands it and knows it, but there's a lot of other stuff out there. TLC, we might see a write once, read lots type drive, and we might start tiering in flash, as an example.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why the flash plus tape, when I was first mentioned this to me, I thought, doesn't make sense, and then I thought about it, and for exactly those sorts of arguments, it might work. You've got decent tape management technology now, automation in there, so could be an option for some people.
Could even end up with a solution with 2 tiers of flash. So you've got your production flash, you could have archive flash, and then off to tape, which is essentially zero cost because you can stick it on a shelf somewhere and you only pick it up when you need it.
Well, tape gives you mobility as well, easy mobility,
absolutely.
which a lot of people still want mobility because it needs to go and be locked in a safe somewhere.
Need,
absolutely.
You two guys ought to hang on to this flash brief, though. You could, you'll be running the place in 5 years. Okay, let's. If we have a look at how we deploy the models of deployment here, we had this again.
We did
last year when we looked at this. What we're saying now is basically we'll be doing much less of the other three.
Yes, I mean they're not greyed out because we think they're going to disappear, because they absolutely won't. But last year we were seeing those deploy. They were very common. In fact, actually last year it was probably the opposite way around. So the one on the end would have been greyish.
I actually remember that we said but all flash if you're very rich or very bright.
And on to Chris's question, around different types of memory technology. We're talking. That's really it's an architecture thing. If we're trying to put flash or memory technologies into a server as close to the CPU, there's typically a very good reason. Metadata, analytics, high frequency trading, it could be any of those, because that's all around latency. You can do that for some things, but I don't think at the moment you can do it large scale, simply because how do you manage 500 servers with these cards in, and who's got software that reports on what they're doing? So there's a bigger question. The flash array, we've answered a lot of the architecture stuff, and I think on some of the newer server type memory technologies, they haven't been answered. I think over time, when we talk about hyper-converged systems, so hypervisors and storage controllers running on a server, then we'll see a lot more of that technology, because you'll have CPU, DRAM, a new technology that's probably sitting in a DRAM slot right on a CPU memory lane, and then probably some SSD, and then maybe tape or something else. So that transition will happen, but it
takes time.
There's the question around resilience there as well, because having flash in your servers close to the processors is great, but if you've only got one copy of it on one server, then what happens? Absolutely. And as soon as you start introducing like hyper-converged type solutions where you're talking about replicating that data between 2 nodes over a network connection, then you immediately start introducing latency, and that's not something you can avoid, at which point you've lost most of the benefits of server-based flash.
You're giving back what you've just given. So Bill's question here is sort of media choice for linking memory to the processor, and how will caching work in that? And we're talking. This is what we're talking about. You say yes, technically good. Management overhead. Problem.
I think technically good, but there's still lots of architectures running around. There's lots, HP is doing something, and other vendors are doing other things. There's a bit of a race going on. There's there's a few companies that have bought companies because they see this. They absolutely see the market opportunity, but we are very early on. And there's probably, we're a bit like a year ago, very, very small niche use cases, and there absolutely will be some. But I think over time, if we look at the all-flash array at the end, as I say, it won't be because the others disappear, but we'll get to a point where the effective cost per gigabyte will be the same as deploying the flash cache type hard drive array and the tiering array. And if we were at that point where the effective cost per gigabyte is the same, you then get all the benefits of an all-flash array, and that's performance, it's latency, it's management, it's capacity planning, it's power, space, and cooling.
Great.
And I think that will be the driver, because they're the things that people will start to realise.
Lovely. Well, actually, let's look at that in more detail then. Phil, take us through. So, performance. Latency, we never used to talk about latency, did we?
No, latency is an interesting one, because if you go back a year, the conversation around latency just didn't exist. We didn't have conversations around latency. We had conversations around IOPS. And you know, it's so important that, and it's interesting because the conversation has flipped. So people talk about IOPS less now because they see flash as this solution to my IOPS problem, and now the conversation is how can I reduce latency? And you know, these are two parts of a puzzle. You know, they go hand in hand. There's a direct correlation between IOPS, you know, and latency. And, you know, one of the important things here is the metrics and what they mean. So, you know, having lots of IOPS is fantastic. You know, that gives us loads of transfers per second. That gives us, you know, basically high performance. But if you can't get high performance at low latency, then the user experience doesn't really improve, because latency is the key metric that defines user experience. So when we looked at, you know, initial niche cases and, you know, where flash was deployed, then we were looking at, you know, VDI is a great example that we talked about earlier, and that was more around low latency than sheer IOPS, because that's what users experience. So, you know, it's that, you know, open up a copy of, you know, whatever word editor you use, bang, and it's there immediately. That's the user experience, and that's what the low latency does.
But Tony, explain to me about this, because low latency and medium sort of latency to me don't seem to make much of a difference.
It depends on your application workload. It's all about performance. For some people, you need absolutely the lowest latency because you need the best performance.
To do what? In what situation does that make any difference?
If you're a trader, then you know, the speed that you can run your trades at, you trust me, they count every microsecond.
It's built around, but their business has always been built around latency.
Absolutely, which is why everybody's business has always been built around latency, but it's what you measure. You know, so we talked about IOPS because that was an easy thing to measure, whereas it's all really been about performance, and IOPS is one element of the performance, but the thing that matters is the user response. Always has been, always will be. So, you know, you'll have some applications, maybe some users, where, you know, they can do with, you know, lesser response. That's fine. But you'll have others that are either more demanding, more fussy, or that genuinely have business value, where you need absolutely the best.
So is this IOPS conversation going to go away then?
I think latency is the new IOPS. I think it's not,
latency is the new IOPS.
I think it will go away in the sense that you can buy a relatively small flash array and get 100,000 IOPS. And a lot of people don't need anywhere near that. There are always going to be use cases for more. So I don't think it's going to go away. You can just push it a bit further to the back of the brain because you don't, you know, you've got something that's really, really fast. The latency piece is the interesting one because VDI is really easy because loads of people notice it. But I was with a customer yesterday. You think so? You know, we were looking at their Oracle estate. So the average wait time. So, you know, Oracle waiting for something from the array was about 25 milliseconds. It doesn't sound a lot.
No.
So if we take that 25 milliseconds down to 1, or even 1.5 or less than 1, for every single read that it does, and 80% of the time it's reading, the CPUs that sit in that server all of a sudden go from idle, even though they're actually waiting, but it's an idle state, to actually processing. So the idle time drops, which means the CPU, even though it was doing nothing, is actually not tied up doing nothing. And he's like, well, if I do that, I can take all of my 4-socket servers and all of the cores that go with that and make them all 2-socket servers and half my number of cores and then half my licensing cost. So latency is not just about user experience, it can have a material impact on other IT costs, and that is one of the biggest use cases I'm seeing at the moment is database licensing. If my CPU estate is waiting 50% of the time idle because it's waiting for storage to give it something.
Yes.
Massive.
That goes straight through to a sort of business plan.
Absolutely.
Doesn't it?
It doesn't have to be
some software companies obviously won't like this idea.
Of course not. But it doesn't have to be transactions per second, or it doesn't have to be low latency trading. You can see, you know, really weird and wonderful benefits just because, you know, that
just
you weren't
remove that bottleneck. Well, I mean, the software companies they licensed that way because it was commercially attractive to license.
It was also easy for them to monitor and manage the licensing because you knew how many cores you had.
It's just good economics.
Will they
Take away
flip
the
it around now
bottleneck
and
there,
check? You know, some of the software companies try and change their licensing models whenever new technology comes along to make
their
own revenue streams be protected. So will they change for Flash? It would be very interesting to see whether they try and what the customer reaction would be.
It's a smart decision, isn't it?
Yeah.
I've got this feeling that you're looking at me like I'm just catching up with the three of you. Maybe with the rest of the audience.
But it is something that storage guys haven't usually thought about.
Yes.
So
Well, because you
And it's
wouldn't,
another-
because it wasn't your conversation in the past.
Exactly.
Yes,
But this could
now
become part of the business case.
it's a way in which they can contribute immediately.
Go on, sorry, go on.
So it's interesting talking to infrastructure guys rather than dedicated storage guys,
Yeah.
because what they're focusing on isn't improving the performance of their storage, because for them that's one part of their infrastructure. So what they're looking at is improving the infrastructure. They're looking at improving response times from an application point of view for the users. So for them, it's, you know, if they can improve the speed of their performance, they improve the performance of the entire stack, their entire, you know, everything up to the right up to the user. And if that means they can get more VMs on a VMware host, then that's great, because if they're not waiting, if this idle time isn't there, you know, it just improves the entire infrastructure, and that's the big difference they're seeing.
And the other sort of, you know, side effect benefit of that is that IT's been criticised a lot for having, you know, the lack of utilisation of the IT infrastructure itself.
Yeah.
This again just automatically improves it without having to do too much, so that you can have fewer of those arguments with the, you know, C-level suite about, you know, why are things so ineffective.
Fewer arguments.
I think it'll also start pulling the application guys and the infrastructure guys closer together, because at the moment they're usually like this.
Not always.
From what I see, then they're not head to head.
There is
always, I want
there
more.
is a reputation and a history.
I want more. I've
and
only got this. That's all you can get. But I think, you know, newer technologies like this will start to make them friends a little bit more, because we're solving two big areas. These guys, it's never fast enough and never quick enough, and these guys, it's a pain to manage, and you know, you don't understand my problems. I think we're almost addressing both of those, I think, with Flash.
And for the application guys, it says, look, it's also a way of actually making the application delivery more cost effective because of the licensing benefits alone.
Yes. I've got a question here from Randy. It's a specific one, but it's germane. How does the impact of garbage collection on latency, and how can the impact of garbage collection, latency and IOPS be minimised? Tech support.
So this is all about architecture. So
yes,
you know, garbage collection is a process that happens within Flash that you cannot control. It happens in the background. It happens when you change data, write data, or delete data. So that there are, you know, you absolutely cannot ignore it. So the most common approach is to massively over provision your Flash.
Right.
So I sell you a drive that is, I don't know, 1.5 terabytes, and I'm actually hiding 500 gig of that, so that I've got somewhere to write to, just in case somewhere else is being garbage collected.
Right, yes.
So that's one element, and by the way, we all do very similar things. You know, we all over provision Flash. That's one way to address it. And then it's the architecture front, at the front end, which is, you know, how do I minimise that? Well, in an array, some people do caching and some people don't. And the Flash vendors would argue that caching is a thing of the past. But caching is good if you have a very full Flash array and there is lots of garbage collecting, because cache, we have a write come in, we mirror it, release the host, we can hold it if we haven't got anywhere to send it. So that it's really important to get that architecture right, because at some point, you know, even though you've over provisioned, you're going to need a backup plan, and that backup plan has to be architected in the system, because if you haven't got it, everything's going to stop. Even though it's Flash, everything's going to stop.
It's not impervious, unfortunately.
No, it's not. No. It's good, but it's not magic.
I was talking about the Flash technologies earlier, and so to give you a quick example, EMLC technologies hide usually somewhere between 30 and 50% of the Flash.
Yeah.
So if you buy a 1 terabyte drive, it's actually a 2 terabyte drive. There's just a terabyte of Flash hidden.
Right.
So you know that's why those technologies are so expensive. When you look at CMLC, it's essentially the same Flash, but we hide less of it. So it's usually between 7 to 10%. So the overhead is considerably
that makes a huge difference.
That's why the price comes down, because you're getting more usable Flash from the same amount of physical Flash. That's where the big price difference comes in.
And that's where the system management is really important, and the architecture of the system and how it is set out to work.
Absolutely, to take advantage of that and make it last.
Now let's have a look at this. Let's have a look at building an all-Flash array.
Yeah.
What you need here. Tell us about this.
So it's an interesting one. So when Flash first came out, the Flash vendors who were looking at Flash, they were building first of all SLC technologies. They were generally using those as drives in the front of 2U rack servers, and that would be the all-Flash array.
Yes.
So it was literally, you know, it was a rack server with, you know, with Linux OS, and then you plug that in, and that became your VDI storage.
Yeah.
And that's fine for niche applications. If you've got 2 of those and you're doing VDI, you can do resilience at the application level. So it wasn't much of an issue. But obviously, having a single rack server is a massive single point of failure. If you have a DIMM failure, if you have a processor failure, the entire thing's going to go down, and that, you know, there isn't anything you can do about that. So Flash, you know, the Flash the initial flash startups were focusing purely on performance, and those were the only metrics they were looking at. You know, that has changed slightly, because while performance is still key, I mean, you know, it's still a big reason why lots of people buy flash. There's no point having flash if you can't use it in your environment. There has to be resilience in there. It has to be as resilient as your existing storage, otherwise you can't move to it. You can't take advantage of that. You know, generally speaking, when you're talking about flash, you're either putting your entire environment or your most critical applications on there. If there's no resilience, that's not something you can do. So most of the vendors are now focusing on this resilience point. So to bring in multi-controlled arrays, you know, to give them that availability piece as well. But to really bring flash into the enterprise, and as I said, this is kind of the last big stand, there's other things that have to happen as well. You have to have you know, technologies like replication. They have to be there. You have to have the feature set that you're expecting from an all-flash array. You know, if you've got an existing enterprise class array with this huge feature set, and you drop down to a box which is faster, but doesn't give you any of the features that you're already using, then that's not something that you can bring on board. It has to provide all the features and functionality that you're expecting of that enterprise class array.
And the enterprise class array naturally is assumed to have an enterprise class lifetime.
Yes,
absolutely.
You know, so 4-5 years at least.
Isn't it a problem, Tony, that there's a very fragmented market with a lot of startup companies in it?
It's a very fragmented market, yes, but it's a market that, because of the nature of many of those startups, they've been well funded. There's been a lot of marketing activity, so people actually understand more about this area, or at least they've heard more about
rapid innovation as well.
But there's been a lot, you know, focused on one or two areas usually, most often performance. Yeah. And so the resilience side has always been the fear factor, and people said, like, okay, great, understand the performance, but can I use it for 5 years? Because that's what my financial budgets say that it's got to last for, and I need that. And that's a really important point.
Has that been solved?
Well,
over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, to give you an idea, we were talking about endurance with the CMRC drives. In order to give people comfort that those can last, we have, for example, a 5-year warranty on our drives and all our flash. So if you've got, you know, flash in a 3-par array, it comes with a 5-year warranty. And even if you've got 3 years support, still covered, you know, those 2 years are covered by the base warranty. So, you know, that's to give people this idea that it is an enterprise class array. It will last for the amount of time you're expecting it to.
Did you have to do that? Because when you went to people, they said, yeah, it's not going to last 5 years.
Actually, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
The big scare was they're going to wear out, and my array is going to fall.
Oh, yeah.
And actually, one of the first things as we transitioned to CMLC technology was to have, you know, the 5-year warranty in place, and to have done all of the architecture and testing around it to make sure we could actually do it. And it is absolutely critical, because today most people write their technology off over a 5-year period, and if you can't offer that, or there is a risk that you won't get that, then people are very nervous. Yep. And if we look down this list on the left, you know, it's critical, right? You know, the efficiency piece you've got to have, right? Otherwise you can't really make it affordable to deploy it for everything. So we have to do something around efficiency. But the others are equally as important. You know, you can't forget about all the reasons you bought your last storage system. Yeah. And people get excited, especially when they're speaking to maybe one of the startups, they get excited and they forget these things. But if we go back to the question about enterprises and are they a bit slow or off the mark, it's not, but the problem is they're looking at the startups and the big vendors, and for them, they have spent 15 years relying on replication and interoperability. And if they look at one of the smaller vendors, you think of all the business process that needs to change. Right, I'm not doing array-based replication, so now I have to find a solution to replicate Oracle, to replicate SQL, to replicate VMware, to whatever it is. They can't make that. It's too big. It's too big. So all of these become absolutely critical, and it's very important when looking at, you know, moving to all flash, that you don't get very caught up on, well, he dedupes at 4K and he does it. It doesn't matter. Yeah. You know, the efficiency piece should get you to the price point that you need to be to make those capital costs the same. It's all the other stuff that you build around that. And again, if you are automating or have automated, then you need all the tools in the box that let you carry that automation. Otherwise, you've got to re-engineer everything.
And your operational processes are key here, because changing operational processes is difficult. It takes time, and you've got to be certain that your new operational processes are going to work. So if you don't need to change them, then you're likely to want to stick with them anyway.
Yeah, well, last section we're going to be looking at some of the business case things, aren't we? So, and this is one thing, this is relevant. If you're interested but struggle to make the business case, or don't really see what the business case is, do let us know. We can maybe help you out with that. So But let's have a look first on data. Bad data types.
Yeah, I know.
Phil, this is fighting talk.
It is fighting talk.
Can't use Flash for media.
No, so this is an interesting one. So we've always talked about good types and bad data types.
Yes.
And I hear other people talking about good data types and they say, doesn't fit. That's not what Flash does.
Yeah.
And one of the important things to remember is that Flash fits everywhere. There is no application that Flash can't do. There's no application where Flash is not suitable.
Yeah.
The big difference is whether or not Flash comes in at the price that you're expecting.
Yeah.
And one of the big ones I always hear is around media. And people will go and you'll say, no, Flash doesn't fit for media because media is already compressed. Therefore, we can't take advantage of compression and deduplication because it doesn't work on those data types. Therefore, Flash doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Now, Flash does fit there. In fact, Flash fits really, really well there. But it comes with a slightly high, a slightly more premium cost.
Right.
But that depends on what you need. So I spoke to a customer a little while ago, media customer, and they'd already had 2 all-flash startups go in and talk to them. And both of the all-flash startups said, what do you want to do? And they said, well, we're storing media. And the 2 flash startups both said, well, we don't do that, and left. So it's just kind of crazy, really, isn't it? So I went in and asked them, what are your actual needs? What are you trying to do? And they were doing very high performance streaming for hundreds, thousands of simultaneous users, and they needed to get basically, as we've discussed, the highest performance, the lowest latency they possibly could. And I said, well, that's Flash. What you've just described is what Flash does. And they said, well, yeah, but we've had Flash vendors in, and they said that's Flash doesn't fit here. I said, well, Flash does fit. It gives you exactly what you need. It's just going to be more expensive than a disk-based solution. And they said, well, yeah, that's fine. We're willing to pay for it because these are our requirements. And Flash does fit there. So it's worth bearing in mind that we talk about these good types and bad types and bad data types.
There's nothing fundamentally, you can't, it's not going to bounce off a Flash array.
It's not going to not store it.
It's just going to be more expensive as a way of doing it.
It's all about cost.
It boils down to that critical app again though, right? And this is that classic example. I can't compress it, I can't dedupe it, so your effective cost per gigabyte, Mr. Customer, will be high. His response is, I don't care because I've got 1,000 users accessing it, and if it goes really fast, I'm fine with that. And that is the opposite. And there will be, compressed files will sit in that. Archive data could sit in that because, like you say, if it's not on a spinning drive, it's probably going to burn less power on a non-spinning drive. So there's never a bad data type. It all boils down to
it's just having enough lines in your spreadsheet to make out what the true
use case
cost of the
business
ownership
case versus the cost. And 9 times out of 10. It boils down to cost, either a total capex or a cost per gigabyte or whatever it might be, and that's where you find the bad data types because you can't compress it or dedupe it. Therefore, it's not $2 a gig; it's 10. But 10 is good because I'm willing to pay that for my most important application that keeps my entire business running.
And if your performance needs are high enough and the business case is there, you'll pay for it because the alternative in that media case would have been having lots of replicated data with a load balancer up front to do it. So your costs are going to go up anyway.
They would have ended up with a spinning disk solution, which would have been huge. They would have got far more capacity than they needed to give them the performance that they required. Now, it may well have worked out slightly cheaper. It might have broken even with the Flash solution. But the difference is, we're talking about a solution that is now 8-9U instead of 40U. So, there's this huge space, and they're in a hosted environment. So we're now talking about taking up a fraction of a rack instead of an entire rack. That's going to make the difference of them saving, rack cost for a year. I mean, that's it's a big change.
Briefly, guys, what are we talking about with management and capacity planning here?
So, I mean, tiered arrays, so in fact, all array technologies, they're pretty easy to use, right? Everyone says that ours is easier than theirs. In a tiered world, you don't really have to worry about your flash. It's really fast, and if your tiering technology is going to use it all up and put largely put the right stuff there. But then you end up having to manage, the middle tier and the bottom tier, and you're looking at a couple of things: how full is it, and how much performance am I doing versus how much space do I have, and how fast can it go? Fine if you've got one array, it's probably not so bad. You've just got to know what you're looking at, and then if you are going to do an upgrade, you've got to work out where am I best to spend my money.
Right.
If you've got 50 tiered arrays, which most enterprises will have, a significant number of arrays, that is, it's amplified, and that's where you get a big storage team who are trying to take all this information in, trying to make decisions, and then trying to go through complicated procurement cycles. In the Flash world, really, unless you've got a use case which is, a significant number of IOPS, all you're really worried about is how full is it? How full is it, and am I reaching any of my limits on my front end? So, if you look at a HP technology, the array will tell you that. So all of a sudden, that guy that's been managing that well for a while now has a few of these because he's done massive consolidation, because lots of performance and all that good stuff. And now think, well, I'm a storage guy, I'm not going to have a job. No, but now you can go and look at automation, which is what you've constantly been distracted from because you're busy
making trade-offs here and working out exactly where the sweet spot is. Yeah.
70% of an administrator's time is usually firefighting, and 30% is innovating. I think Flash is the mechanism to flip that. That says, now I don't really have to worry too much. I still need to look after it, I'm a bit like a shepherd, but but now I can spend a lot more time thinking, right, how can I improve application delivery, or how can I automate so that the application guys can come and self-service, or how do I become cross-functional? So now I'm not just the storage guy, now I'm the converged systems guy, and then we're all more effective. So there's lots of different stuff I think that comes from moving out of a relatively complex world.
Now I always ask people to put money calculations onto things when they come into the studio, and everyone goes, oh well, you can't really, how long's a piece of string? But fair play to you guys, you rose to the challenge and you've come up with this. And there are some of the things that we've been talking about before, specifically looking here, power consumption, power and heat, and there's quite big drop-offs, aren't there?
Yeah.
Where'd you get these from?
So this is built from one of our 3-part arrays, a tiered versus an all-flash. So same solution offers the same usable capacity, but this is basically the advantages of moving to flash. So you can see basically more than 80% savings in everything. And again, this was actually for another customer in a hosted environment, and they were being charged, I can't remember exactly what their rack rates, but let's say £25,000 per rack per year. This meant saving over a 3-year period. They were going to save the price of a second rack.
Yeah.
Over a 3-year period, that all of a sudden starts adding up quite considerably on top of all of the savings that we've already got here. Yeah. So it's actually compounded by that. But an interesting one is the weight one, actually. I
was going to say you can build data centers with thinner floors.
Well, this is I've actually seen. I have to say I've witnessed this with my own eyes. A pre-populated rack wheeled into a data center and it fell through the floor. So
you shouldn't laugh.
You shouldn't laugh, but it is funny. It's one of those things where you watch it falling and you just.
Oh my!
I don't know what to do, and it's an interesting one. And weight was becoming quite an issue with disk arrays because the whole point to drive down costs, we were looking at massive density. So we're looking at stacking disks behind each other, huge shelves that take 70 disks, but huge tiny amount of space. And weight really was beginning to become quite a problem because disks are really heavy.
And there are some old data centers out there as well.
Yeah, and there are really ropey data centers. So this is. I know it sounds like a silly one to add on there, but actually it is, for some people, that's quite important.
Now, these figures are from real life. They're not from the contents of your own head.
No, these are real life.
Yeah. Okay, that's
the other interesting one is that in the past, when we've asked the register audience about the cost of electricity, it was somebody else's problem.
Yes.
And that's changing dramatically. Never mind if you're in a hosted environment, then it's always been a problem because quite often some hosters actually charge you an awful lot of money for electricity compared to the standard rates.
I did some work with a bank at the moment. And we looked at deploying 5 petabytes of raw flash, giving them an effective capacity of roughly 4 times that, across a broad set of applications and use cases. And then you compare. So we didn't do 4 times, we did 2 times, so twice the amount of disk versus the flash. And it was something like, in power, space and cooling, based on their real costs, something like 1.8 million euros a year less to run it on flash.
Business now.
With the same capital cost as disk.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, Phil, so on this one, minimising risk. Can you whiz us through this? There's a lot of sad things on this slide.
There's some red on here as well, which is always something to avoid.
Yeah.
And an interesting one, because we've talked about compaction, and deduplication ratios are one that you have to be wary of. So if you're talking to an array vendor, an all-flash vendor, and they're giving you these astronomical, they're saying to you, we'll get 10 to 1 dedupe on your data, but that's a significant risk. And it's very easy. I get to these conversations.
You're not going to get 10 to 1.
Well, even if you do get 10 to 1, so let's say that means you're buying 10% of the capacity you actually need, which sounds great, but all you have to do is deploy one new application that doesn't deduplicate, and you have nowhere near enough space.
Yes.
And that's a significant risk. So high deduplication rates are great because they drive down cost, but they're also really risky.
You want to believe them don't.
Yeah. So you might not get them initially, which means that you buy the array, put it on the floor, and it doesn't give you what you want. And if you haven't got anything in paper from the vendor, all they're going to do is say, please buy some more storage. And the other one is if your data change rate, if your data type changes, and new applications, everyone's always deploying something new. I get more conversation about new applications deployed than ever before.
I'm going to have to whiz you through these other two. Low availability?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you haven't got replication, you've only got, it's relatively new, single controller boxes, these obviously lead to unplanned downtime.
And interoperability?
Yeah, so a very obvious one, if you're a small startup, you probably don't have a lot of support with, mainstream vendors for fiber cards, for operating systems, file systems, any of that.
Backup and recovery.
Backup and recovery. If there's no support for those, what happens if it doesn't work? You back it off to them, who fixes it? This is another key one.
Okay, do you just want to, I just want, because we're in our final minute, looking on the further reading there, guys, pick something that you think that the audience is going to want from there.
So I would say, personally, I would go and look at the customer experiences one.
Yeah.
Understand what other customers are doing, why they're doing it, and what they've used it for, and actually, how they found it. Because we can tell everyone, but actually, it's much better coming from a customer that's had a requirement and is doing something about it and has tested it and done it. And I would go for customer videos every time.
Yeah, Phil. And last word from you.
Yeah, absolutely. The most important thing is what are people actually experiencing. It's great to talk to a vendor, hear what they've got to say, but it's really important. What is everybody else doing? What are their experiences?
Yeah.
Very critical.
Great, we're out of time. Thank you very much, guys. We've gone through a lot of material there. Remember, you can get the PDF because it's got the numbers on as well. So please do that. Please let us know what you thought of this. We do more of what you want at the Reg. Thank you for your questions as well, and we will be back soon with another Regcast. Until then, from the team here and from me, Tim Phillips, goodbye.